intelligence figures and previously worked in the Israeli Military International Law Division at the Israeli Embassy to the UN and in the Israeli Justice Ministry. He is the author of Justice in the West Bank and the editor and translator of A Raid on the Red Sea, and this book also. So please join me in welcoming the Council's Chief Program Officer, Ronan O'Malley, and our speaker for the evening, Mr. Yonah Bob.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank all of you for coming. And as Marianne kind of noted, we've been in contact with Yonah for many months relating to his incredible book, and we're going to get to that. And you all have a copy yourselves to read, which is great. It's basically discussing the myriad of ways and incredible and dynamic kind of methods over the last 20, 30 years, especially that Israel has been encountering the possibility of Iran developing a viable and deliverable nuclear warhead. But obviously, both Yonah and I were thinking that we obviously have to address, the kind of horrific events of the last 3 weeks since October 7th, almost the exact 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. And we will, get back to your book, but sadly, about 1,400 Israelis been killed the first few days by Hamas, dozens of children, the largest loss of Jewish life in a short period of time since the Holocaust. In the understandable kind of response from that Hamas knew would come, probably maybe 4,000 to 5,000 Palestinians have already been killed. Of that, maybe 1,000 are children. These are kind of dark and dire days. I don't want to go into the kind of horrific nature of the attacks or what happened the first few days or the first 2 or 3 weeks. I think a lot of people have seen that in the news. But you have long and deep experience and connections at the highest levels of the IDF, the Israeli military, and also Mossad and Shin Bet and Israeli intelligence services. I think, can you maybe help us with the question that a lot of people have? How is it that one of the best intelligence services in the world didn't pick up on this, number one, and number two, how is it one of the best and most, I suppose, capable smaller militaries for a short duration, high intensity, small theater warfare wasn't able to respond better when this first happened?
Yeah, first of all, thanks again for bringing me here. Thanks to everybody. It's great to be in Houston. I was here about 25 years ago, and it's grown quite a bit since then. But it's great to be back. We are talking about some very tragic, difficult things. Regarding your question, how did the almost all-powerful, super-duper advanced .com Israeli military intelligence apparatus get surprised by Hamas, which is basically, a series of fancy militias, and Israel's military is so much more powerful, whether it's Air Force, technology, Navy, in every parameter. So there's a few things. We'll start with the strategic failures on the Israeli side. One is just hubris. Okay, Israel has beaten Hamas, and there's another group in Gaza called the Islamic Jihad that has also fought with Israel. There have been a number of rounds of conflict between Israel and Gaza that were just Israel and Islamic Jihad. Israel won every single time. Did it win in like a complete way? No, but every single time Israel, killed a number of top officials, on the other side, whether they were Hamas or Islamic Jihad in Gaza. And Israel, had the upper hand in that sense, and so Israel was used to that, and so Israel couldn't basically imagine that they could be surprised, and so Israel had all kinds of technology on the border, all sorts of fancy sensors. They spent billions of dollars building a very fancy wall that isn't just a wall. It had all sorts of fancy sensors that would let them know, oh, people are coming towards us. Israel has drones, Israel has, the best aircraft, and, so basically they're watching everything that's happening in Gaza. They couldn't be surprised, except they were surprised. Okay, so that's the first thing is if you have hubris, if you have arrogance, if you don't take the other side seriously, you can be surprised. My metaphor for this, anybody here a March Madness basketball fan sometimes? Okay, a few people. So you have the little team from, really short people who nobody's ever heard of. And on any given day, they can upset the really famous big team where all the top players are going to go into the NBA. It can happen if they play the perfect strategy, they're highly motivated, and the other team doesn't know anything about them and isn't taking them seriously. That's what happened, number one. Number two, empirically, Hamas lured Israel to sleep. Okay? Actually, the truth, I was going to say, people outside of Israel maybe don't know everything, but there's some really knowledgeable people here. So maybe some people here might have known that although Hamas, the last time Hamas and Israel had a big conflict was May 2021, there have been several rounds of conflict between Israel and Gaza, between Israel and Islamic Jihad, this other group in Gaza. And every single time since May 2021, Hamas stayed out. What's the logical conclusion from that is Hamas is deterred. Hamas is afraid. In fact, Hamas took a hit within Gaza. They looked like they were weak. They looked like they were the cowards. Islamic Jihad looked like they were the tough people who were ready to fight Israel. So if Hamas stayed out of that many rounds, the logical conclusion is they're deterred. Okay, but if you're in charge of national security, you can't just go on what's the most likely. You need to be ready for what about the 10% scenario? What about even the 5% scenario? Israel wasn't ready for that. They drew a lot of troops that used to be on the border because they basically thought Hamas isn't going to attack us. We have fancy technology that will warn us if they do, and then we'll send reinforcements. That's the strategic picture. The tactical picture is just as impressive. All right, what Hamas did was they shot about 2,000 rockets all at once. They'd never done anything like that. Most of the last few weeks, they've been shooting about 50 to 100 rockets a day. That probably sounds like a lot here, but 2,000 rockets is a whole different degree. And Israel was out of its mind. 2,000 rockets, what is this? What's going on? The same time that they shot 2,000 rockets, they sent about 3 dozen drones to kamikaze Israel's sensors, Israel's lookout towers. And then they used retro technology. All right, this one I had no idea about. Nobody had any idea about. If you Google motorized hang glider in Gaza, you might find one article from like a couple years ago. They used motorized hang gliders. There are videos of literally Hamas people manually dropping grenades or bombs, from a motorized hang glider on top of Israel lookout positions. And this is all happening the same time as the rockets. So Israel's thinking about the rockets. They're not noticing that they're getting blinded across the board by the drones and the motorized hang gliders. If that's not enough, right after that, perfectly synchronized, Hamas, in large numbers, hits 2 major crossings. Now Israel's getting reports. Wait, it's not just rockets. They're hitting the crossings. What's going on? How come we didn't know? They don't realize that they've been blinded yet because they're confused. And right around them, when they're starting to get a handle on that, Hamas invades in 29 different spots. And they can do that because Israel's blinded. And now Israel doesn't have a clue what's going on because, wait, how can they be here and here and here all at the same time? This was not a scenario that was talked about, okay? The worst case scenarios that I was told behind closed doors by top people is maybe Hamas might get lucky and take over 1 or 2 villages for 3 hours and then run away. That was the worst case scenario, and even that was thought of as unlikely. So 29 break-ins in 22 villages, taking them over for a day to 2 days with almost 3,000 Hamas fighters or terrorists, however you want to call it. That was not something that Israel was prepared for strategically or tactically.
And then in terms of the military response, we hear a lot of reasons that the military is preoccupied with kind of flare-ups and violence between settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank. They're concerned, understandably, maybe about Hezbollah in the north. But you hear these reports from a kibbutz or a small village where someone said it took 8, 9, 10, 11 hours just for someone to get here. Why was the military's response so kind of slow and dysfunctional?
Right, so you pointed out already, again, maybe some people here, because it's a very knowledgeable group of people, might know that there's been waves of terror that Israel's been dealing with from the West Bank for about 18, 19 months. If you were to talk to somebody, this war started on October 7th, if you were to ask any Israeli security person on October 6th, what's the biggest security challenge that Israel's facing right now? Not over the next 25 years. The next 25 years, Iran. That's why the book is about Iran and the Mossad's war against Iran, because that is the big issue for the next 25 years, 50 years. It's been the big issue for the last several decades. But if you ask, what's the sort of right now issue in your face, it would be terror from the West Bank. Okay, that's what the issue has been. And Israel moved, they typically would have 8 to 10 battalions in the West Bank to maintain security. They were up to almost 30 battalions, or almost tripling. That doesn't come from nowhere. You need to bring it from somewhere. They took it from the southern border near Gaza. They took it from the northern border facing Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? Hezbollah is the call them fighters, terrorists, who control most of Lebanon. There are other groups, but they are the big power there because they have most of the guns. And so, yes, so Israel was less prepared on the border. They already were relying too much on technology, not enough boots on the ground, and they moved more boots away. And then also you can say, again, I don't know how much people follow the domestic politics in Israel, but until this war, there was a major fight in Israel going on about the judiciary. Not something usually that people, usually people are following the Israel and Iran, Israel and the Palestinian conflict. Suddenly the whole world was talking about Israel's judiciary. So that was a hot issue that was splitting and distracting even the army. There were reservists, and most of Israel's military is based on reservists. And there were a large number of reservists that were saying, we're not showing up for our call to duty until the government withdraws their attempt to, depower or reform, however you want to say it, overhaul the judiciary.
And maybe just for people not able to keep up with it as much, could you explain that a little bit more? And it maybe relates to Netanyahu's current political condition, in that these were the biggest peaceful democratic protests in Israel's history. And really always, a lot of people say it's a great expression of a democratic process. There were people for conservatives and liberals, people from the military, from academia, from the intelligence office, coming out in the streets and protesting. But you talked about what they were protesting, that Netanyahu and his coalition were trying to make changes to the judiciary that would reduce its independence, and gave a lot of people concern about there's basically the breakdown of balances of power and within the government.
Sure. Mostly I want to stay in international relations, but we'll go a little bit for a second into Israeli domestic politics. One, with all of this serious stuff, I do want to do one comedic moment. This is a slight fact check. So the protests against the judicial overhaul were some of the largest in Israel's history. The largest that I know about was actually in 2011 when the price of yogurt went up. All right? People went wild. There were literally 1 million people, which in Israel, the country of 9 million people, and they were camping out in parks for 2 months. That was actually an even larger protest, but little comedy. In Israel, we have to laugh about some things because there's so many serious things going on all the time. So, okay, moving on from the dairy. So the judicial reform, judicial overhaul, whatever you want to call it. The history is that a right-wing party known today as the Religious Zionist Party, it's had other names for about 30 years, has been upset at the Israeli judiciary, saying that they're too activist. The judiciary has at times ordered supporters of the Religious Zionist Party to withdraw from settlements, to evacuate settlements, for certain settlements or outposts to be bulldozed if they were put illegally, according to even Israeli law. So they basically want to say, hey, court, stay out of this. This is a government issue. This is a legislature issue. The court shouldn't be deciding these kinds of things. That's sort of the big picture background. There's another group, the ultra-Orthodox, who don't like the court to tell them about anything what to do. They have, I would say, a different understanding, and sometimes even about what democracy means. And so if in this country we talk about the division of church and state, so in Israel they call it religion and state, whatever, there's a little bit less of a division, and the ultra-Orthodox would like there to be no division, or very little division, but the majority in Israel still want there to be mostly a division, so that's another fight, and the Supreme Court tends to side with the secular majority on that in Israel. But the real turning point was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has had public corruption cases against him. up until the point that he had the public corruption cases against him, he stopped most of the attempts to overhaul or reform the judiciary. At the point where he was indicted, he started to become more in favor of that. Now, you can say that he finally was convinced of the correctness of the arguments of a number of the other people who I just mentioned. I'm not going to take a side on that, but if you look at the timing, that is the timing.
Okay. And just to turn to the next kind of few weeks and months, obviously it's very hard to predict anything, and how it directly ties to your book. Hamas would exist without Iran, but would not be as capable, would not have the degree of training or weaponry or just tactics without Iran. And the even bigger, much more dire threat coming from southern Lebanon, Hezbollah, a large, you'd call it political faction, militia, terrorist organization. It's kind of everything. It's a political and social group all rolled into one. It is, in terms of number of individuals, probably 4 or 5 times larger than Hamas, dramatically much more heavily armed with weaponry and training, again, from Iran. What do you expect to happen with Hezbollah in the north? And do you think that they see this as, when Israel is heavily distracted in the south, that this might be an opportunity to engage and get much more violent in the north?
Right, so I'd say the 3 biggest questions that people are facing in terms of uncertainty about how the whole Middle East may be reshaped in the next couple of days, next couple of weeks, to last for the next 10 years, reshaped, is when is Israel going to do its ground invasion? And sort of part B of that, what is it going to look like? What will happen after Israel's ground invasion? If Israel succeeds in toppling Hamas, who is going to run Gaza? Because Israel's made it clear that it does not want to, that it's going to leave and hand it off to somebody else. We have no idea who. That, by the way, is probably the answer right now. Israel has no idea who. And your question about Hezbollah, right? Hezbollah, as you said, they have 10 times as many rockets as Hamas. All right, around 150,000 rockets, okay? And they don't just have 10 times as many rockets, they have much better rockets. They have precision-guided rockets. So if Hamas can shoot 50 to 100 rockets in a day and not hit very much, occasionally wound somebody, here and there, occasionally hit something around the Tel Aviv area, but, they could shoot, 50 to 100 rockets a day and they're not killing that many people. Hezbollah can overwhelm Israel's missile shield, no question. Now, does it mean that they ransacked the entire country? No. But, estimates some years ago when Hezbollah had fewer rockets and fewer precision rockets were that Hezbollah, in a war between Israel and Hezbollah, Israel would win hands down, but Hezbollah could kill at least 1,000 civilians and damage an even larger number of buildings and houses, including key locations, some Israeli military bases, some Israeli business centers. So will Hezbollah get into it? Nobody knows the answer, I think, including Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. I think he wants to push as far as he can without getting battered by Israel. But at the end of the day, I would say, look, if he was going to do it, he would have done it the first day. The first day, Israel was completely confused, totally lost. If he had done it, he would have had strategic surprise. Israel would have had an even harder job deciding, do we send troops to the south to deal with Hamas, or do we send troops to the north to deal with Hezbollah? If Hezbollah tries to surprise attack Israel at this point, when Israel goes into Gaza, that's what some people think is going to happen, they're not going to get very far. Israel called up 360,000 reservists, and a lot of those reservists are in the north. Israel didn't send them all to the south. Israel positioned a lot of them in the north. Hezbollah will not be able to repeat what Hamas did in the south because there are already thousands and thousands and thousands of Israeli troops, far more than there were 3 weeks ago, up in the north. So I would have, again, I don't want to say 100%, I wouldn't bet, but if I had to, I would say they probably will continue to push, but not do a full-scale war.
And related to your book, is that ultimate decision going to come from Khamenei, the Ayatollahs, and Iran, or Hezbollah? Do you think, a degree of independence to make that decision on their own?
So of all of the proxy groups that Iran has in the Middle East, and Iran has proxy groups in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Gaza, the West Bank, Iraq, probably some other places, so they have a lot of proxy groups. Hezbollah was the first. Hezbollah is the one that is most strongly connected in terms of basically 100% of their funding, ideologically. We know that even though Israel has said to date that Iran did not give a specific order to Hamas to invade on October 7th, as you said, there's no way Hamas could have had anywhere near that success without the funding, logistics, and training from Iran in order to do that. Hezbollah is a whole nother story. Hezbollah was given a direct order by Iran on October 8th, provoke, start trouble, and we have basically seen every single day since then rockets, anti-tank missiles, systematic attempts to blind Israel's sensors on the northern border. It's not going to work this time because, again, Israel now has a lot more troops on the ground, so they don't need to just rely on sensors. But Hezbollah was given an order by Iran. So I think I would put it a different way. I don't think that Iran is necessarily going to order Hezbollah to roll the dice because they know that right now they may lose one of their proxies, Hamas in Gaza, and Hezbollah is their most precious proxy. Okay. And at the end of the day, what does Iran care about? They want to be able to develop nuclear weapons. They want to be able to grow their power within the region. And their biggest tool to prevent Israel from stopping them from getting nuclear weapons, from stopping them from dominating more of the region, is that they have Hezbollah. And they can say, Israel, if you hit Iran, then Hezbollah will rain hellfire down on you. And that's absolutely a deterrent for Israel. And that is why Hezbollah exists, to protect Iran, not to protect Hamas.
Okay. And this last thing, and then we'll turn more directly to your book, but just I know it's on a lot of people's minds, and obviously you have such deep experience with the IDF, military intelligence, military and intelligence agencies of Israel. Israel is a small country. Gaza is tiny. I think for our Houstonian audience, Gaza is about 140 square miles. To give you an idea, the 610 loop is about 90 square miles. So it's about only 50% bigger than the 610 loop, but it has almost 2.5 million people in it. So incredibly dense. They're basically a population density at least probably 4 to 5 times, say what we have here. Another way you could put it, I think 3 Gazas could fit inside Beltway 8, for if you live like off of Beltway 8. How do you see this going? Obviously, before they staged this attack, Hamas has been preparing for months and years. It's dug hundreds of miles of tunnels. It's going to have booby traps all across Gaza. It doesn't wear a uniform. It's going to embed into the civilian population, even knowing that that's going to lead to the deaths of thousands of Palestinians. This is going to be very hard and difficult warfare. How do you see it going? And it's complicated by the fact that now we have something very unusual with 200 hostages, a scenario I haven't really had before. Do you see any way this doesn't end up with hundreds of Israeli soldiers killed and thousands more Palestinians, civilians killed?
No. Okay. However Israel goes in the ground invasion, a lot of Israeli soldiers are going to get killed. A lot of Palestinians are going to get killed. Israel will do its best. It does its best to avoid civilian deaths. There were 1 million Palestinians in Gaza City, in the northern Gaza, 750,000 already evacuated. That was like the first thing that Israel did to try to avoid civilian deaths. But even after that, Israel makes phone calls to particular residences, get out of there. In past wars, Israel even did a special method called roof knocking, where they would drop a missile that doesn't explode but makes a loud noise on a roof. If the people didn't listen to the phone calls, they'd say, okay, now really get the hell out of there. But Israel's not perfect. The United States is not perfect. If you look at the record of the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, you can't always get every civilian out of the way. War is bad. Innocent people die on both sides. So there's going to be more tragedy. The hope is that Israel can replace Hamas, damage Hamas enough so that they won't. I don't know what people have seen here, but the butchery that they did on October 7th is not just killing. Cutting people to pieces, raping women, killing babies, elderly people, and then taking a lot of them, kidnapping them. That is what has rallied the United States and even a number of EU countries that sometimes are critics of Israel so strongly behind Israel at this point in time, which wasn't always true in prior years. So there's support for Israel to remove Hamas as the ruling party in Gaza. And then, as I said, does Israel know what it's going to do next? Absolutely not. I can tell you I'll call it, I was in a very close briefing with a senior diplomatic official, I have to call him, very, very high up, let's say, and we asked 5 different ways, and the evasiveness on the answers was not just because he didn't want to answer, it's because he really didn't know. They haven't decided. Now, what are the logical things they could come up with? All right, there's a Palestinian Authority that runs basically a government, basically a mini-state or pre-state in the West Bank. They used to be in control of Gaza. Hamas toppled them, did a coup about 15 years ago. So they could try to bring them back. They could try to have them form some sort of coalition, something with some group of local Gazans who aren't affiliated with Hamas. Most of Gaza isn't affiliated with Hamas, doesn't particularly like Hamas at this point. Hamas, besides not liking Israel, is pretty religiously fanatic, and I'm a religious person, so I have nothing against religion, but when you impose your very fundamentalist version of religion on everybody, that's the opposite of any separation between church and state. So they're actually not that popular always with a lot of Gazans. Could that work? Maybe, except as I just said, Hamas toppled the Palestinian Authority already once, so why couldn't they do it again? Could the UN be in control? Well, the UN was put in place of peacekeeping force called UNIFIL in Lebanon after the 2006 second Lebanon war between Israel and Lebanon. And they gave this UNIFIL force a larger, more powerful mandate than most peacekeeping forces have. And during, their job was to prevent Hezbollah from rearming. And during their mandate, Hezbollah went from, I think, 10 or 20,000 rockets to 150,000 rockets. So the UN doesn't have such a great record. It's not that they didn't try. There were a couple times they tried and then they got shot at and they ran away. So would the United States want to get involved in nation building again? I don't think so. Maybe in another 20 years, but I think right now the United States has had enough with nation building. So it's not that obvious that there's really a good option for who can not be Hamas and run Gaza, but I think some hybrid of those options, and maybe with Israel maintaining some sort of security zone, maybe maintaining some sort of troops on the outskirts of cities in case whoever is put in charge is suddenly going to get killed by whatever Hamas or Islamic Jihad people are left over. Is that going to work? I have no idea. Nobody knows. But the decision in Israel is it's bad enough. October 7th was so bad. Roll the dice. Try to get Hamas out of the way. Hope for the best.
And turning to your book, if any of you are curious about the inner workings of Mossad, especially, you've had multiple in-depth interviews with every director of Mossad since the last one, who last served in '89, I think. Right?
Back to 1989.
This book, I guess, reveals a lot of things that most people had no ideas about in terms of the covert operations, the depths of operations, not just in Iran, but across other parts of the Middle East, that Mossad and its kind of allies in other parts of the region have gone through. I suppose Iran has been pursuing a nuclear program since the 90s, but Mossad in particular and other agencies as well have been countering it in many different ways. Everyone has the books, they can read themselves, but can you maybe just discuss maybe in a lot of ways really the effectiveness of those tactics over these last 30 years, especially in terms of what we might consider the covert operations, sabotaging operations, the operations that were occurring in different parts of Iran that might have been never confirmed or denied, but obviously were successful.
Okay, I'm going to get to that, but I just sort of want to introduce the book a little bit for not everybody here has read it yet, or maybe you're deciding if you're going to buy it. The biggest selling point on this book is any book about the Mossad or the CIA basically until now has been about events that happened 50 years ago, 25 years ago, because people don't declassify. They don't declassify until a lot of time has gone by, maybe until everybody who was involved has passed away. This book is talking about Mossad operations that happened as late as 2023, 2022. About 70% of the book is Mossad operations that happened in 2020, 2018, and going forward. So like the last 3 years, the last 5 years. That's about 70% of the book. It's unprecedented that we were able to get this past the Israeli censor. What happened? You see in chapter 1, there was, we call it the heist, where Israel in 2018 was able to seize Iran's nuclear secrets from the heart of Tehran under the nose of all of Iran's security forces and was able to get it out of Iran. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu unveiled this to the world in April 2018 and put out tremendous information. And that was a breakthrough for a number of people. It was a particular breakthrough for me. I had been interviewing people from the Mossad, from the CIA for years, but this gave me a different level of information, a different level of access, and I was able to, put that forward. So that, first of all, and I'll say from the reviewers, people say it reads like fiction, but it's all actually true. All right, so those are like the biggest reasons why, if you haven't bought the book already, you should buy it. It's fun, exciting, and it's actually true, and there hasn't really been a book like this before. It introduces to the world Yossi Cohen. Yossi Cohen was the Mossad director from 2016 to mid-2021. There have been some books before about Mossad directors before him. There has not been a book about Yossi Cohen. It also introduces to the world the current Mossad director, David Barnea. If originally we were maybe going to sort of keep the book mostly about Yossi Cohen, in 2022, suddenly a whole bunch of top Iranian nuclear scientists, weapons scientists, terror chiefs all started to drop dead, jump off of rooftops on their own somehow. I'm under the Israeli censor, so I have to say it like that, or I have to say according to foreign sources, it was the Mossad, something like that. So then we had to add some of those new chapters. So that's new about this book. Substantively, we talk about policy, okay? So there's the exciting part, but we get into serious policy. October 2025, even if the Biden administration somehow gets back into the JCPOA, the nuclear deal of 2015, or a 2.0 version of it, in October 2025, the limits on Iran for centrifuges, those are the machines that spin around really fast and enrich uranium in order to potentially make a nuclear bomb, don't entirely expire, but mostly expire. Around the same time, the snapback, the ability of the world to snap back global sanctions all at once on Iran also expires. So even though technically parts of the deal run until 2030, 2031, the heart of the deal is basically out at that point. So even if Iran gives up all of the uranium that it has now, at that point, it will have enough machines running and no snapback that it could basically go from 0 to multiple potential bombs in days. In like a really short amount of time that wouldn't be detectable. Okay, you had a question about effectiveness. So how effective, has the Mossad been effective in stopping Iran? So we answer this in two ways. On one hand, we say absolutely. Israeli military intelligence said in the 1990s that if nobody intervenes, Iran could have a nuclear weapon within 2.5 years. We are 30 years later and Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. That's a success. However, we say the Mossad's job and Israel's job is never done. Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon now than it has ever been before. So it hasn't crossed the line. But if people followed the enrichment levels, so under the JCPOA, Iran is supposed to enrich only to 3.67%. At some point they went to 5%. At some point they went to 20%. That, by the way, is a big deal. I'm told that the jump from 5% to 20% is actually the most important jump. And then in mid-2021, they went to 60%. 60% is already like super close to the weaponized level of 90%. All right? So they have now, depending on different estimates, enough enriched uranium at 20% and 60% for 5 to 7, maybe even 8 nuclear weapons. There are some other issues that they need to resolve. You have to detonate a nuclear weapon in a very special way. You can't just light a match next to a nuclear weapon and expect it to detonate like an atomic bomb. There's very special issues. Delivering it is very special. You can't just put it on any ballistic missile. You have to miniaturize certain things. But given their ability to solve those issues, the uranium part could happen basically overnight. So That was a very long answer. The answer is, has the Mossad been effective? Absolutely. They've delayed Iran by 30 years. Does that mean Iran won't get a nuclear bomb? No. It means that the work will have to continue. And if Israel, the United States, other countries that care about this don't properly balance not only diplomacy, not only a viable military threat, but two together, Iran could absolutely still get a nuclear bomb.
And you cover it in the book, I can't remember if it was 2014 or what year it was, but some of the previous Mossad directors, Dagan and then later Pardo, had different opinions with Netanyahu with regards to an actual large-scale direct strike by Israeli aircraft in terms of like how successful that would be. They both felt that these ongoing covert operations were more successful, and they also probably don't cause a huge international flare that Israel's now gone to war directly with Iran. People hear about it a lot and think about it a lot, but what are the realities of if Israel was to actually do a large-scale, airstrike on Iran, and how much of the sites that the Israelis know about could they actually take out, and what do we not know about, and how effective do you think it could be?
So I'm trying to be, objective journalist here, cover both sides, and so I bring in Tamir Pardo. He was the Mossad chief from 2011 to 2016. He made Yossi Cohen his deputy chief, which set him up to be able to potentially be his later successor, although Pardo actually didn't want him to be his successor, but the prime minister decides that, not the Mossad chief comes before. And Pardo said Israel basically can't really stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon with a airstrike. He said, why? Because, could you delay Iran? 6 months, a year, maybe 2 years, yes. But that Iran has basically developed so much knowledge, the fact that they've already gotten up to the 60% enrichment level, and you can't eliminate knowledge. You can't eliminate the number of facilities that Iran has. When Israel successfully took out Iraq's nuclear facility in 1982, Syria's nuclear facility in 2007, there was one facility. Iran has, dozens of places. Now there's a smaller number that really matter, but the point is, between the knowledge and the number of places and the anti-aircraft defense systems that Iran has, what he was saying is, Israel can't do it alone. If Israel ever wanted a preemptive airstrike to stop Iran's program, to really stop it, it would need the United States involved. Also because Israel doesn't have bunker buster bombs. Who knows what a bunker buster bomb is here? This is a knowledgeable group. Okay. So bunker buster bombs, for those of you, no embarrassment, who didn't raise your hand, is sort of the way it sounds. Iran has a couple of facilities built literally under mountains to make it hard to hit. The United States has bombs that are specially made, first of all, to be large enough and a delayed fuse to be able to go under the mountains and blow up everything. Israel doesn't have that technology. Israel has asked for decades for this technology from the United States. No president has given it to them, although CIA Director Michael Hayden once told me after he was not CIA Director that he wished they had. But everybody, has different things that they say when they're not in office. They don't have to deal with the consequences. And I'm a big respecter of Director Hayden. So anyway, the point is, so that's Pardo's perspective. I have to say that at this point I have a different perspective. I saw a classified briefing. I can't give all of the details a few months ago. What Israel can do now with its F-35s and the combination of its F-35s along with F-16s, F-15s, is not just hit so many targets of Iran's nuclear program, but also the anti-aircraft defense and also military targets and symbols of Iran's rule. And what I saw is the capabilities that Israel has used with artificial intelligence to be able to hit, not just a terrorist in a particular neighborhood or particular block, but literally to target somebody on a porch, on the third floor of a 10-floor building and just hit that. That's how accurate, when Israel isn't surprised. When you're playing defense, Israel got surprised, but when you're playing offense and you get to plan, that's how accurate Israel can be with its artificial intelligence targeting. And they've applied that to Iran, and they have planned out that many targets in the event that it would be necessary. I hope it won't be necessary, but from what I've seen, Israel could pull it off. But Tamir Pardo is a very serious person. He's not the only person who says whatever Israel would do, Iran could come back from it within about 2 years or less.
And to try, it's a hard and difficult and dark topic, but to maybe finish on a question with maybe a potential, maybe it might take a few years, upside, and then to turn to audience questions. Sadly, the next few weeks and months are going to be devastating, especially in Palestine. There are going to be thousands more Palestinians killed. Hamas their leadership might be all killed, heavily degraded. But you have 2.5 million people living in a tiny area that they're not allowed to leave. They have effectively no citizenship. They don't belong to any country, really. It's hard. Even if they wanted to leave, they can't, most of them. One of the highest rates of unemployment, especially youth unemployment in the world, some 40 to 60%. Just a breeding ground for anger and frustration. And when you have 12, 13, 14-year-old boys whose mothers get killed, their sisters get killed, their grandfather, at a certain point, it's just going to become, a rage that can be, accepted by Hamas's replacement, whoever it might be. I don't care, you call it Group A, B, C. There is no long-term military solution to this. There's hopefully, eventually, a diplomatic or negotiated settlement for this. And maybe what is interesting from your book is beyond, well, I found it in a lot of ways even more interesting than the covert operations, was that Mossad was so heavily involved for the last 20 plus years in developing relationships all across the Arab world for many of these countries that were, proposed vehement enemies of Israel. But now, because of their shared deep concern about Iran, those relationships are getting tighter and tighter and closer. And, sorry to have such a long answer, but maybe if something good could come out of this, the Yom Kippur War happened.
Yes.
And yes, Yom Kippur War.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's
is there possibilities that these new relationships you have, especially with the Saudis, could lead to some fundamental change and agreement for what can happen for Palestine?
Yes. Okay. So the answer is yes. And I'll explain.
Yeah.
Okay. So after all of the horrible things that we've talked about, and there's going to be some more horrible things that are going to happen on both sides, unfortunately, in the days and weeks and maybe even months to come. Nothing to do about that at this point. The good news is that people in certain groups used to say to me, well, nothing is ever going to get resolved because Israel and Arabs or Israel and Muslims, they just can't get along. They've been at war for millions of years. So it just can't be resolved. Okay, Exhibit A, Israel has had peace with Egypt for over 40 years. Exhibit B, Israel has had peace with Jordan for over 25 years. And Exhibit C, from my book, the Abraham Accords, okay, Israel now did 4 additional normalizations with Arab and Muslim countries in 2020, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. So Israel now has peace or normalization with 6 Arab or Muslim countries. All right, so it is doable. It's happened, and it has stayed. And the most powerful one is actually Egypt. People might remember a guy named Mohammed Morsi. All right, he was the head of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who was committed to Israel's destruction, and he ran Egypt for 1.5 years, and he didn't cancel the peace agreement. Okay, and now he's out of the way. But the point is, there have been lots of examples that coexistence is possible. Now, do I think that there's going to be a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians tomorrow, or in a year, or even 3 years? No, because it takes time to build that up. But the Abraham Accords have a wave, and part of what we talk about in the book is that the rest of us in the world found out about the Abraham Accords suddenly in August 2020. The Mossad was building it for decades. All right, and then Yossi Cohen, who's again we talk about lots of different Mossad directors, but he's the largest character in the book because the Abraham Accords happened in his term. The raid seizing Iran's nuclear archives happened in his term. Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC Quds force who was killed, happened in his term. The killing of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, Iran's nuclear chief, the father of their bomb, happened in his term. A number of Iran nuclear facilities that happened to just blow up on their own happened in his term. According to foreign sources, it was the Mossad. But the peace things happened in his term, and so he is meeting in 2017 with MBS, with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and a couple weeks later, the head of the IDF, the head of the Israeli military, Gadi Eisenkot, and the top minister, Yuval Steinitz, say publicly, we are sharing intelligence with the Saudis. That's in 2017. It's shortly after Yossi Cohen is meeting with MBS, and that was a game changer. It was a complete game changer, and everything that happens afterwards comes from that, because the UAE, Bahrain, they don't move forward unless they have the blessing of MBS. The Saudis, MBS, they're the big dog, so to speak, in that area. So they didn't want to be first. They wanted to sort of be last in line. They want to get the most concessions for normalizing with Israel. Up until this war on October 7th, I would have told you with high certainty that there would have been at least an interim normalization between the Saudis and Israel by February. This was being told to me by the highest sources, and one of the reasons I trust them is back in March. All right, here's a little thing about, we'll get to the questions in a second, a little thing about book writing. If you ever write about current events, be really, really careful, because current events change right as you're about to go to print, and you have to decide, do we have to scrap the whole book? So we had an oh my God moment in, I think it was March, is when Iran cut a deal with the Saudis. 90% of the media is saying, that's it, there's no normalization between Israel and the Saudis, because the Saudis just cut a deal with Iran. The two things are inconsistent. I went back to my sources, the best sources you could have on this, I'll say, I can't say more than that. And they said unequivocally, that's not true. The Saudis are just playing a game. They just want to drive the price up higher that they're going to get from the United States from Israel, and they were right. All right, there was you heard MBS interviewed a few weeks ago, and he said we are super duper close to a deal. After this war, my sources are not so sure, but in the long term, there will be. Why? Because MBS wants it. MBS wants to join Israel in terms of the technology, in terms of economic development. He doesn't want to be held up by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He wants certain concessions. He can say, look what I got from the Palestinians, but it will be short of resolving the conflict. Will it be before February? Now there are some doubts, but at some point, I do think it will happen. And I think all of that will pressure both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side to eventually be more reasonable. I'm not going to give you a timeline when this is going to happen, but I am an optimist. At some point, there will be peace.
Just the kind of the players we haven't discussed, global players, maybe in particular Russia. You discussed them in the book. Michael asks, what will Russia/China, what role will they play in this conflict in the next few months? And maybe related to that, are you surprised that Putin has kind of not even tried to almost kind of walk the line with regards to between Hamas and Israel? That he is, I suppose, not even kind of tried to kind of cloak his opinions?
So I don't think they're actually going to have a massive role. I think that Russia and China have tremendous influence in the Middle East when the United States isn't there. So when everybody is seeing that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East, which until a couple of weeks ago was basically a bipartisan policy going back to the end of the George W. Bush administration, Obama, Trump, Biden, bipartisan. Everybody wanted to have a smaller military footprint in the Middle East, end the forever wars, get on with competing with China and other things. But when the United States is all in, like it is now, the United States has 2 aircraft carrier groups and huge amounts of fighters, large amounts of troops returned to the Middle East, China and Russia are not anywhere near as much of an influence or factor. So I do not see them having a big influence on this. That doesn't mean they won't have an influence in the long term. The only reason that Iran has survived sanctions is because of Russia, China, and a couple other countries, but mostly Russia and China. So they do have a big influence, but not necessarily on Israel.
And obviously the Ukraine war, the Iranian drones are invaluable to the Russians. Have killed many Ukrainians with them.
Yeah, so I mean, look, one of the upper hand points that Israel got was around a year ago when it was revealed that Iran was giving drones to Russia to use against Ukraine, the Europeans, for a long time, had a lot of criticism of Israel, but Ukraine is their number one issue. Ukraine is basically in Europe. And when they saw Russia invading Ukraine, they had an oh my God moment and said, oh my, we need to actually have militaries. We could have trouble, and we can't just rely on the United States, and we have to help Ukraine. And the idea that Iran was taking Russia's side, not just verbally, but giving them weaponry to use against Ukraine, completely shifted the European perspective on what Iran was, much closer to the Israeli perspective, the American perspective, that Iran is a problem country, is a country that destabilizes, a country that has encouraged terrorism, not just in the Middle East, but in a number of European countries as well. And if that was something that Europe ignored until that point, Europe stopped ignoring it once they saw that Iran was taking the wrong side, so to speak, in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Okay. I love having student questions. A good one from Stephen from Caney Creek High School. Do you believe that if Iran fails to achieve a deliverable nuclear weapon in the short term, they will reconsider their options on how to become a regional power?
No.
Okay.
Iran is very, very committed. When I said that Israel was arrogant and disrespected Hamas, Israel does not disrespect Iran. Israel has tremendous respect for Iran. Israel thinks that Iran is among the smartest, most long-term players that there is, that Iran, one of the reasons that they have succeeded so much in negotiations with the EU, with the United States, with lots of people, is because they don't think about months and years, they think in terms of decades and maybe even centuries. So when you have a player that's that patient and that intent, I do not see Iran giving up, going for a nuclear weapon, giving up, even if they weren't getting a nuclear weapon, trying to be the hegemon in the Middle East until there is a significant regime change. It wouldn't be enough for it not to be Ayatollah Ali Khamenei who's in charge, because the other Ayatollahs and the IRGC have very similar attitudes about nuclear weapons, about the Middle East. It would need to be a completely different group running Iran. And at least most of the people that I know right now think that when Khamenei passes on, it's going to be a pretty similar group running things afterwards.
Okay, and then just for the sake of time, just maybe two questions. I'll just do this one and the last one, maybe kind of looking forward to combine a few people with similar questions. But Diana asks, is Israel the only one deterring Iran from becoming a nuclear power, or just a key player because of its location? Can you discuss Turkey's role or the role of the other kind of regional powers, or are they all just depending upon Israel to do the heavy lifting?
I would say that Israel is the most important party preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. If you read this book, you'll see again, according to foreign sources, how much the Mossad has done physically to stop Iran from getting to that point. I would argue that one of the main reasons that Iran agreed to the 2015 JCPOA, which Israel didn't like very much, but one of the reasons they agreed to that deal, to give up the uranium that they had at that point, to agree to limit itself for 10 years or 15 years, was the threat of military strike from Israel, which they took seriously because they were seeing what the Mossad was willing to do. So I would say that Israel is the most important party. I wouldn't give Israel all the credit. The United States, you like the JCPOA, you don't like the JCPOA. The JCPOA certainly delayed Iran's getting a nuclear weapon by some amount of time. Trump's massive pressure campaign didn't stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but it certainly delayed Iran in some ways for a certain amount of time. Each of these things didn't have enough. Again, from a policy perspective, what I try to say, and we put in the conclusion, is it's not about in or out of the JCPOA. It's not about Obama or Trump or Biden. It's about balancing a viable military threat with diplomacy. You need both. You just have one, you won't figure out the dilemma of Iran. So you need both. So the United States, I don't think, has ever really put both together. You're sort of either more on one end or either more on the other end. But whatever the United States has done has been somewhat helpful. The EU countries, I think, have been less helpful. And I think together with Israel, they've been helpful. I don't think that Turkey has helped a lot on this. Turkey does see Iran as a rival, but they don't have that much ability to, impact Iran, within, some things like a nuclear weapon.
Okay. And these three questions, they're similar, and I think a good kind of way to close things out. So I'll just put them all together, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
And I am volunteering you to sign books afterwards.
Yeah.
So,
I'm just getting my pen here. You said you're giving me three questions at once.
Well, they're all very similar. So,
okay.
Erica, another great student from the Audi International School, asks, how long would it take, and with what probability for peace for it to be achieved between Israel and Palestine? Okay. Related to that, Edgar asks, as a young man who sees the world in an optimistic view, could you ever see a future where Israelis and Palestinians could peacefully coexist? And then similar type question, Sheila asks, President Biden has advised Israel to again work towards a two-state solution for Israel and Palestinians. Do you see implementing of that two-state political framework as the right way to go? I mean, I suppose in the big picture, what, like I said before, if I gave you a magic wand, what is your solution? A very easy question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do believe someday there will be peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I think it will be a long time off. We're not going to see it in the near term. Maybe one of the positive things that could come of toppling Hamas could be reuniting Gaza and the West Bank so that one person can negotiate on behalf of both of them, which has been a problem for the last 15 or 20 years, and maybe that would enable something. But you really need probably new leaders on all the sides who have not spent more than a decade ignoring each other and being mad at each other, who are more ready to take gambles. Peace with Egypt between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, those leaders took gambles. So you need leaders who are willing to take big risks. It would be a big risk. I do think it'll happen someday. Once the conditions are ready for it to happen, I think it could happen in a year to a few years. The key thing is for the conditions to be ready, and part of that has to be restoration of trust. And you can't restore trust tomorrow when so many Israelis and so many Palestinians are going to have just killed each other. But in the long term, yeah, I do think it's possible. I do think they can coexist because of all of these other examples of Israel and Arabs who have been able to exist. I do believe in the two-state solution. What does the two-state solution mean is different now probably than it was 10 years ago, probably different than it was 20 years ago. Israel two-state solution will have to withdraw from some portion of the West Bank. But will Israeli settlements be removed? Maybe not, maybe less. What do you do about Jerusalem? What you might have done about Jerusalem 10 years ago or 20 years ago might be different than it was now. The Palestinian state, what will it look like after everything that has happened? Even if they sign a deal, I think Israel would go, even if you have an Israeli leader who's brave, who wants to take a risk, they would probably insist for some period of time that the Palestinian state would be what we call a state minus, meaning you have complete sovereignty over running the state, over internal security, but external security, Israel would still have some sort of clause to be able to protect itself from terrorism, including, following, somebody across the border who was just in Israel in order to catch them. So none of this is going to happen tomorrow, but, you need to keep an eye on facts that change on the ground. That changes what the two-state solution will look like, but some kind of two-state solution, at some point, I still think is the way to go.
And just because people hear it, and there are a lot of Israelis, academics and experts, or people experience the government, and experts in the U.S. who would say a two-state solution hasn't been viable for 10, 15 years. The West Bank is already tiny. It's carved up into areas A, B, and C. If you give the Palestinians this little patchwork of territory, they can't make a viable state. Is there any possibility of a one-state solution where the Palestinians actually would have citizenship? Or if Israel refuses, it has to be a Jewish state, that is impossible?
Yeah, there's no possibility of a one-state solution. whether it's because of the Holocaust or whether it's because of the number of security threats that Israel faces. Again, even if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is resolved, Israel will be in danger from Hezbollah, Israel will be in danger from Syria, Israel will be in danger from Iran. So as long as Israel has that many dangers, Israel's going to need to have complete control of its security and not moderate that or balance that in any way, shape, or form. When people say the two-state solution isn't viable, what I say is what the two-state solution was in the mid-1990s may no longer be viable. And that's why I said in the 1990s they were talking about withdrawing 20% of the settlers, but Israel can withdraw from the vast majority of the West Bank without having to move a single settler. Will that make the Palestinians happy? No. But again, if the Palestinians see that a large number of Arab countries are normalizing with Israel, and Israel is making it an offer to get most of what it wanted, you might find a Palestinian leader, not Mahmoud Abbas, who is the head of the Palestinian Authority, who hates Netanyahu, and Netanyahu hates him. The two of them aren't going to make the deal. But somebody new, maybe.
All right, will you all please join me in thanking Yonah Bob? Thank you.